Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honour to be here, and thank you also for organising this very interesting symposium, and I am sure it will be as interesting as it promises to be through the day. I'm very much looking forward myself to hearing the contributions of the other speakers, whose work, of course, I've known over several years, and I think it does make for quite a cohesive cluster of papers that I hope will enable you to get some flavour of the kind of research that's being done in a European context on these particular topics. So, in keeping with the theme of this symposium on demography and gender in an international perspective, I'm looking, as Sharon said, at fathers' involvement in family life and changing cross-national differences. What I'm actually going to do is present the results from a couple of papers that share a common theme, both authored by myself and my colleague from the Centre for Time Use Research, Evrim. Yes. Do you think I need it? Right. It is actually on, isn't it? Yes, maybe I'm not standing close enough to it. So what I'm going to do is focus on comparative cross-national trends in father's time spent in domestic chores and childcare over a 50-year period. And this is, I suppose, my perspective on this comes from my background in time use research and my position in the Centre for Time Use Research, where we collect and gather and harmonise time use diary data, and we now have quite an extensive archive that everyone is free to use. So all the data that I'll be presenting today, all the comparative trends, for example, are from data that's accessible to all of you at no cost using our data archive. That's the multinational time use study. In relation to the substantive topic, fathers clearly, I think there's widespread agreement, are contributing more over time. There's quite an extensive literature on this already in the US and also cross-nationally, including countries from Europe and other countries. I've listed here some references. There are, of course, many others. Fathers' contributions, why does it matter? What's it about? Why are we interested even in fathers' contributions? From the literature, the psychological literature on child development, I think there's quite clear evidence that where fathers are involved in their children's care and upbringing, that this has positive long-term effects, long-term outcomes. In relation to mothers, and I suppose this is more of the focus that I've taken in my research, fathers' involvement in domestic labour, in family labour, allows mothers. It's essentially a sort of time payoff. It allows mothers to combine childbearing and child rearing with employment, and this is the link to fertility, which is an area that other people here have done research into as well. And it allows them to sustain their employment trajectories. I've just put, there's a couple of references here. The references in relation to mother's time in relation to fertility are perhaps more well known. These are actually a couple of recent doctoral students, Marta Seis from Barcelona and Laura Langer, who was at Oxford. they've both used panel data to look at outcomes, women's outcomes, women's employment outcomes, women's earnings and employment outcomes, dependent on their husband's contributions to to childcare and housework at the time of birth and subsequent to the birth of a child. So these are, I think, really nice longitudinal pieces that look at that relationship over time. So I think they're an important contribution to the literature, one that I'd recommend you to look at if you're interested in this relationship. So what are the explanations that have been put forward for an increasing trend towards fathers' involvement in domestic labour and childcare? There's two main sets of explanations. Of course, there are many variables that are subsumed within these, and perhaps many other additional important variables that I'm not really going to address. But social policies, policy provision, this is clearly one of the main foci of a lot of cross-national research that's used multi-level modelling, for example, to look not just at the individual characteristics of mothers and fathers, but also at the national contexts in which they live. And in terms of trends and in terms of an explanation in relation to fathers' increasing contributions and a move towards gender convergence or gender egalitarianism, the argument goes that as these policy structures advance, as they develop, as more parental leave is introduced, as in particular paternal leave is introduced, as the provision of state care for children becomes more widespread and more subsidised, more strongly subsidised, then the domestic division of labour becomes more egalitarian, and the work-family balance of both parents becomes more similar in structure. And then gender ideologies, another main set of explanations around gender ideology. It's certainly clear that those countries where attitudes towards gender egalitarianism are more positive, have a more equal gender division of labour. And so here, the explanations are couched really in terms of processes of social diffusion of attitudes and norms through the social strata in relation to education in particular, and also across countries. So the idea here is that there may be, through a process of social diffusion, there may be, we may see over time a catch-up effect, if you like, from more traditional gender structures, from countries with more traditional gender structures to countries with more egalitarian gender structures. So there's two aspects to this presentation. One is to look at the effect of education on fathers' changing contributions in low fertility countries. And the other focuses on changing contributions in relation to welfare state regimes. Okay, so that's, if you like, picking up on the social diffusion effect in the educational attainment, and then on the welfare policy regimes in the second half. And the changing differences of the title, this is to do with understanding processes. There's quite a lot of literature on trends in fathers' contributions to family work, and there's quite a lot of literature on cross-sectional differences, but my argument is that really what we need to be looking at is the way in which differences between subgroups change over time. Because by doing that, we can understand more about processes of change. So, for example, if the gender division of labour is becoming more egalitarian in a country where social policy measures are not changing, this points to an indirect, or indirectly points to, perhaps I should say, an effect of other factors like gender ideology. Anyway, I hope this argument will become clearer as I go on. So the data that I'm using comes from the multinational time use study. We're looking at 14 countries which have been selected on the basis of their data series over time and the quality of the data. The period is 1970 to 2010. We've tried to bring up to date some of the more recent time use data sets that have emerged in the latter part of the first decade of this century. And we have this, it's 40,000, over 40,000 diary days in this sample. We choose to focus on fathers who are aged between 20 and 49 who have a child under 5 living in the household. We can't identify actual biological fathers, but in most cases, this is in any event a parental figure for the children concerned. I think the rationale here is that we argue that younger fathers of young children are the ones who are most likely to have an influence on the employment and child rearing opportunities of their female partners. Yes?
Is that with one child under 5 or at least one child?
That's at least one child, yes. So number of children is something that we control for in the analyses. Okay, so educational level and the relationship with fertility. So what we were interested in here is this link that other authors have pointed to between the increasing participation of men in family work and the fertility upturn of the first decade of this century in countries that had fallen, if you like, below the 1.5 total fertility rate definition for a very low fertility country. This is the paper. In fact, I perhaps should have put Francesco's name, Francesco Billari, on the front of this presentation. Now I think about it, it probably would have been. Anyway, this was the paper that I'll be talking about, and in fact, this was a really nice special issue, and there are papers in it from both Maria and Letizia as well. This special issue of the Journal of Family Issues, Studies of Men's Involvement in the Family, which was edited by Fran Goldscheider and Eva Bernhardt and Trudy Lapgard. So this is a slight refinement on the idea that as fathers contribute more to family work, then women are enabled to pursue their employment trajectories. This more specifically focuses on the opportunity that it gives women by providing help at these particularly time-pressured points, the opportunities that gives women to perhaps have a child, have a first child, or to proceed to a further birth having had a first child, while still being able to maintain employment commitments and other family commitments. So in relation to education, this is a social diffusion argument. Changes in gender attitudes among more highly educated younger cohorts are associated with changes in the contribution of those fathers to domestic work and childcare. Okay, so this is just total fertility rates by country over the period that we're looking at. So, oops, no, wrong one. This is the group here. What we've done is just extract from UN data, I think, the countries that we're actually using for this study. And there's this group here, it's actually Germany, Slovenia, Spain and Italy, who clearly at this point start to, well, perhaps rather before then, diverge substantially here in the early 1990s to about, well, between 1995 and 2000, and then perhaps there's some evidence for an increase in fertility in this group of very low fertility countries from around that point in time. Interestingly, if you look at the ISSP gender and family module over this period of time, looking at the same groups of countries, there's this question about male and female family and employment roles. We've just extracted the percentage of men aged 20 to 49 agreeing with this statement that a man's job is to earn money and a woman's job is to look after the home and family. And we just looked at the change very simply between these two periods. As you can see, there's a general decrease in the percentage of men agreeing with this statement, or men of this age agreeing with this statement, but this drop is particularly marked among the very low fertility countries, Germany, Slovenia, Spain, and of course, well, we don't have, this question wasn't asked in Italy in 2002. So, again, indirect but indicative evidence. This is just the same data presented as a bar chart. So this is our sequence of time use diary studies for the different countries. This gives the number of diary days for each country from the different periods. We've just broken this up into categories to give you an idea of where the data is coming from. In the second part of this talk, we have added some more data sets, in particular to this section of the table. So for this analysis, we looked at, we put fathers' minutes spent in core domestic work and childcare together. I have argued in another paper that one should never do this, but we thought that because of the particular argument that we were making, which is that it's fathers' contributions to both family work and childcare that has an impact on fertility, that it was reasonable in this particular instance to do that. We used OLS regressions, looking at interaction effects between low fertility country and time, college degree and time, and college degree and low fertility country. And then the control variables, including number of children, employment status, marital status. Yes?
Just a quick clarification question, because I'm not super familiar with the structure of time use data. By
some fathers that have multiple days contributing to the sample, or is it each father is contributing one or some constant number of diary days to the care?
The surveys do have different numbers of days. We use robust standard errors to control for the clustering of number of diary days within survey. Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't really know much about the literature, but I was wondering, why did you decide to not use anything like income-related as a control variable as well, together with like employment status?
Well, one reason is data related. The income data on the multinational time use study is not particularly good. It's a broad categorical variable. We tend to use education as an alternative. I agree the connection between them, the relationship between them is interesting. But I guess the main reason is the data issue. Yeah.
Thank you.
What did you pack into core domestic work?
Sorry.
What did you pack into core domestic work? What kind of?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I should have defined that. Core domestic work is cleaning, cooking, and clothes care. The 3 C's. So the sort of feminine defined household tasks, regular, repetitive, routine household tasks. Okay, just the raw data. This is the graph really that shows very significant increases for all countries over this period in relation to average minutes spent in core domestic work and childcare for men of these ages and with a small child in the house. So, it's quite striking. It's quite obvious. We've put the low fertility countries. Sorry, keep pushing the wrong one. Are the dotted lines. So they, you can see that they fall very much, within the sort of general trend that many of these broadly move in parallel. But within that, what do we find? So, I'm going to peer here at the. So, this is the model 2 that includes the basic the control variables. I think there's no particular surprises there. Very low fertility countries here in general are lower in terms of fathers' contributions than the group of other countries. College degree is strongly positive. Employment status has a very strong negative effect on fathers' contributions. And weekday, also the day of the diary being a weekday. In model 3, we've added 2 interaction effects. The very low fertility by time trend, which shows that it's because it's positive. This shows that over time there's a stronger effect, a stronger increase, if you like, a stronger positive effect over time of the fathers being in a low fertility country as compared to one of the other group of countries. Sorry, the other group of countries. And then the college by time interaction effect, which is slightly weaker in terms of the minutes, but also shows that there's a positive effect of college education as opposed to not having college education over time. And then finally, the fourth model introduces a low fertility country by college interaction. So this shows that the effect of having a college education is more strongly positive than in a low fertility country than being in one of the other countries from the other group of countries. Yes.
Clarifying question. I
Yeah.
might be interpreting the college time output incorrectly, but that's a pretty small coefficient. That's less than a minute, right?
It is, yes,
Okay.
yes. But yes, I mean, remember that's by year.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's
So
a...
over 50 years.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
That makes more sense. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, but it is smaller. I mean, it's interesting that it is smaller than either the effect of being in a very low fertility country over time, or the effect of being college educated in a low fertility country.
I have to ask the married having question. So is that
Right.
relative to fathers, single custodial fathers, or what's the reference group there? So initially, I was wondering, with Germany and Italy, why would one group married and cohabiting? But I'm just not sure what's the group.
You're asking about the married
Yeah.
cohabiting, right?
Is it married versus cohabiting, or is the reference group single? Single father?
Yes, it is, yes. Because we regrouped married and cohabiting fathers together, so it's against single fathers, yes.
Okay, and there were enough single custodial fathers.
Yeah, there were enough. I mean, we did talk about whether we should include this or not. There were just about enough, but yeah, I mean, we did try this the same. I mean, we did a robustness check, not including this, because we were concerned about the numbers of single fathers, and it doesn't make any difference to the overall results. Yeah. Okay.
Could they make the
Predictions. Sorry.
kids?
They have to have kids in the house.
Yes, yes. So this
Yeah,
is...
if they lived in separate households and both had custody, which is real possibility for that.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if it would be.
Yeah, I don't know how would that be in the United States if they have joint custody, do they generally assign, how does the time use get classified then? If the kid moves from house to house, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Well, it varies a lot. Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm really... I mean, I remember that we looked at the numbers and thought, yeah, it's just about okay to include this. And we tried it without, and it didn't actually change anything. But, yeah, sorry, I can't... The question's about custody and how that relates to single fathers, and I haven't really thought through, I'm afraid.
As Italian time use, it's impossible to distinguish in the sense that it depends if that day of the diary the child was there. Then it's assigned in that data with that family.
Yes,
So
yes.
it's, in a sense, it's a problem of the strength of time use. I mean, you get what you get on
Exactly.
that day. Right?
Yes, yes,
So it's
yes.
because you have big
And-
numbers that you can have
Yes,
nice result, because otherwise you cannot compare one single day. I mean, this is
yes.
cheap.
And I suppose you make the assumption that if the child is there, then there is some form of parental relationship. Yeah.
But on the other
Anyway.
hand, in the Swedish data,
Yes.
I know that even though Sweden is sort of progressive and we do have fathers who are divorced or even never married who have custody of children, I mean, I think in more 7,000 diaries I come up with 10 men with children in the household not being married.
Yeah.
There are more
Yeah.
men not being married who do childcare at some part of the day because you check on other people's kids. But I was just
But it's not, I mean, in relation to fathers spending time with their own, with children in the same household as them, it's a small proportion of time, isn't it? Looking after other children is a very small proportion of
yeah, but I wouldn't
parents'
be able
time.
to estimate a regression like that on Swedish.
But you're not low fertility.
No. We're not low fertility.
Okay, the predictions from this model, so these are just model predictions based on typical values of the independent variables. I've listed below 34-year-old employed married father with 2 children. So this is very interesting. This shows, if you like, the those crossover effects that you expect to see with interaction effects. Here in the 1970s, you see an expected relationship between college education and the low fertility and non-low fertility countries, the more traditional low fertility countries here. But a very interesting rise in predicted minutes of involvement, particularly for these college-educated fathers from low fertility countries, which at this point around the year 2000 is actually crossing the equivalent line for those in the rest of the countries. And similarly, you see a sort of a catch-up effect here with the non-college educated as well, to a lesser degree, but apparently catching up with the rising trend here for the non-college educated from the group of countries that aren't very low fertility.
Could you just give do you have off the top of your head an idea of what the average number of minutes a woman has been? Just for comparison?
No, sorry. It would be more than this. Okay, so right, significant recent increases in the contributions of younger, more highly educated fathers in the low fertility countries that are now experiencing upturns in fertility. And the pace of these increases exceeds that found in the comparison group. And the period that we've been looking at, the period over which this change occurs, coincides with this large change in gender attitudes that we see in the ISSP data from 1994 to 2002, and also the period during which total fertility rates began to rise in the very low fertility countries in the late 1990s. So we interpreted these findings as suggestive evidence, obviously it's not direct, for a process of social diffusion of more egalitarian gender relations and attitudes, which acted to facilitate this turnaround in the pattern of postponed and foregone fertility, which characterized the lowest low and the very low fertility countries over this period. Okay, so moving on now to welfare policy regimes. So there's been this systematic variation that we know about in men's contributions to domestic labour according to policy regime type, and there's a huge number of references here, and I've put Esping Anderson, an iconic figure perhaps, but yes, I mean, I haven't acknowledged here a large body of research that's been responsible for showing this. Here, these are some relevant time use research references for women doing less housework in national contexts where there's more public childcare available and where men are eligible to take parental leave, and in particular where they have dedicated paternal leave. And the cross-sectional findings, just for those of you who are not familiar with this, men in the Nordic countries contribute most to housework and childcare. Those in the southern European countries contribute the least. Men from liberal and corporatist countries of the corporatist countries of continental Europe fall somewhere in between. And again, explanations have involved differences in gender ideology and policy effects, usually in combination, of course. So this is the paper which is currently under review. We take the same group of fathers, and this time we do distinguish housework from childcare because there are quite distinct trends here over time, and we wanted to look at the differences between these two groups of domestic tasks. We've updated the data file. We now have, I think, 17 countries post-2000, 9 of which fall between 2005 and 2010. The big gap we've got here is the Nordic countries, annoyingly. They became very protective about their data. There was a big change perhaps in their attitude towards data protection over this period, and we found it very difficult to get hold of Nordic data for this period. We have now got agreement, I think, for the Finnish, Norwegian and Swedish data. So that's I mean, the next task for us in the multinational time use study is going to be to add those Nordic data sets to this data series. I've put here the 1-minute diary, 5-minute diary, 10-minute diary. When we were thinking about this, and particularly thinking about participation, we realized that there's actually quite an important methodological point here, which is that if fathers are given the opportunity to report 1 or 2 minutes of care for their children, as they are in many, certainly in the US data and in the Canadian data, then their participation rates, they have, if you like, a sort of an advantage in terms of participation rates, because if you have a 10-minute diary where you have to decide which is the most important activity that you're doing, say you do 1 or 2 minutes of childcare, but then for the rest of the time you're doing something different, and for the 8 minutes that you're doing something different, you choose, that's the activity you put in your 10-minute diary slot, then that 1 or 2 minutes of childcare is lost in a way that it's not lost in a 1-minute diary record. Did I explain? Do you see what I mean? So we thought, well, this is actually important, and we need to take this into account in some way, because it does give undue weight, if you like, in terms of participation to, in particular, to the liberal countries, to Canada and the USA, where these methods of diary collection have tended to be, on a single minute basis. So what we did is we look at the minutes spent in these activities by all fathers, so the overall average, the ones that the data, if you like, that we're familiar with seeing. But we then also took a cut-off point of 15 minutes, and I should say, we did, again, do robustness checks, taking 5 minutes, 10 minutes as well. So what we look at, in fact, is the probability of fathers reporting at least 15 minutes of housework or childcare. So if you like, this enables us to include fathers who record 10 minutes of childcare in their diary, or 15 minutes of childcare in their diary over a day. And we've called this involved fathers. We don't actually mean to imply by this that, doing 15 minutes of childcare means that you are an involved father. We were just trying to get away from calling these participating fathers, because participation has been defined previously as any childcare, and clearly that varies according to the way in which the diary is measured. So if someone can think of a better term, we'd be very happy. So we then look at minutes spent in the activity by involved fathers, defined in this way. These are just the raw data by regime type. This is childcare. Oops. You can see this is the big increase in childcare in the liberal regime countries, but all of the countries show very strong increases in childcare time by fathers. Perhaps the trend is slightly less steep in corporatist countries, but this is the average, the red. But very strong increases. Housework, a rather different, more patchy pattern here. The Nordic fathers right up here, southern fathers right down here, and then here you've got the slowdown, the stall, the kind of data that's led people to argue here in the US and in some other liberal countries in particular, that there's been a real tail off of fathers' contributions to housework over the period since the turn of the century. And then the corporate fathers, again, lagging somewhat behind.
Is this weekdays or weekends or combined?
This is combined, yeah, this is just all. Okay, so here we looked at childcare and housework separately, and here I see I have defined what core housework is: cooking, cleaning, and clothes care. And then the participation rate is whether the respondents spent 15 or more minutes on the diary day in the activity. Here we use gamma regression. This is Evrim's idea, and her argument is that the distribution of the dependent variable is such that really a gamma regression is more appropriate than the OLS regression. That's for the average minutes, and then logistic regression for the probability of involvement. And then a similar range of control variables as in the previous. So because there's some complications with interpreting gamma regression coefficients, I'm just moving straight on to the predictions from these analyses. I do have the coefficients. I should say that, again, we tried this with OLS regression, and in fact the results are not that much different. So this, for those of you who are interested, this is the shape of the dependent variables, and this is why Evrim argues strongly that we should be using a gamma distribution rather than an OLS regression. I bow to her superior statistical expertise. Okay, descriptive statistics. So we've got the 4 regimes here. We can compare means and the percentage of involved fathers. Here for childcare, Nordic fathers here, but actually, in terms of the overall average, and this is what we're perhaps most familiar with seeing, liberal fathers do outstrip the overall average for minutes spent by Nordic fathers. But if we look at the percentage of involved fathers, then you can see that actually for the liberal countries, that's far lower. So we'll see more of this when I get to the predictions. But note also, another thing that will emerge is this mean for involved fathers, which is quite dramatically higher than any of the other regime-type countries. Okay, this is what the predictions look like, the regression predictions from the gamma model. This is the most familiar graph. This is overall childcare, predicted minutes. So we have the Nordic regime here, as we expect, and the other three, perhaps a bit of a catch-up effect from southern fathers. The standard errors are the shaded areas around the lines. But the interesting thing here is when you look at, this is the probability of reporting 15 or more minutes of childcare over the day. The liberal fathers are actually now sort of, running neck and neck with southern fathers. Quite a low percentage of involved fathers. But here, so this is the minutes per day spent by involved fathers. So here, this trend, outstripping all the others among that smaller proportion of fathers who are reporting at least 15 minutes of childcare per day. So fathers' involvement in childcare has increased substantially, but there are changing regime differences. The gap between the Nordic and the liberal and southern fathers has narrowed. Fathers in corporatist countries lag behind, and there's apparently some polarization occurring among liberal regime fathers. Housework, this is again quite striking. The overall mean, 66 here, much higher for the Nordic fathers than for any of the others. And also, the percentage of involved fathers is higher for Nordic fathers in this case. So here are this is the overall picture. But this is composed of, here, quite a different picture actually, where, you get this, pretty much flat lining on increases in involvement, if you like, 15 or more minutes per day of housework from both the corporatist and liberal fathers, and this steep, by contrast, increase in probability of doing housework among southern fathers. And then the predicted minutes in housework, liberal and Nordic fathers here together. This is among involved fathers, those who are doing some housework. So again, in contrast to the previous slide where you see this real flat line here in the liberal countries, US, Canada, and UK, in terms of participation, in terms of involvement, you get, among those who are involved, quite a steep increase. So, Nordic countries, fathers in Nordic countries continue to set the bar. Higher polarization among fathers in the liberal country, liberal regime countries, and southern regime fathers apparently catching up with housework. So overall conclusions for this part, this section of the paper, of this presentation. Fathers' involvement in family life has increased. It's the involvement in core housework rather than the involvement in childcare that now distinguishes Nordic fathers from the others. Fathers in corporatist countries have been less responsive to change. The increasing contributions of liberal fathers, of fathers in the liberal countries, are associated with quite a marked polarization in terms of those who are involved and those who are not. And then southern fathers, some indications of catch-up effects, starting at very low levels but showing significant increases. So, coming back to gender ideology, social policy, two conclusions really. From the first section of the presentation, we find suggestions of a social diffusion effect in more traditional countries by educational attainment, and this of course in a context where policies have not changed very much over this period of time in the direction of greater gender equality. In relation to welfare regime differences, we see continuing differences by welfare policy regime types, which do suggest the importance of social policy. But again, within that we see catch up among fathers from more traditional countries, again, perhaps pointing to diffusion of more egalitarian gender ideologies among particularly fathers from the southern regime countries. And what I'd like to throw out to you is this question about the polarization that we seem to be seeing in the liberal regime countries, particularly in relation to childcare involvement and time. We see really quite low rates of increase in fathers overall, in overall fathers' involvement, and yet among those fathers that are involved, we see really very dramatic increases in the time that that involved fathers are spending in housework and childcare. So I think this is one of the, we have a puzzle here, and it's something that's I think working this through and teasing this out can bring out perhaps some ideas about the possible explanations, the reasons for this. And so coming back to changing differences, I think this is an example of where we can see that these changing differences between regime types over time do give us some possible clues, at least of where to look for explanations in relation to these sorts of changes. So thank you very much.